The future of work, exciting, and maybe even a bit scary. The reality is that we're now in a new world and a new way of thinking. And the question ultimately is we have to make the right decisions. We need to understand the risks that are at stake, and we need to understand that relationship between the worker and the employee is even more important today than ever before. Hybrid, is it here to stay? Is it going to take place? And are there best practices that we can learn from? These are questions that almost every company today is asking themselves. Today, we actually have done research, a lot of research across Europe to understand exactly what is going on in the hearts and minds of our employees. And ultimately today, we're going to have a chance to talk about that. We'll have a chance to talk about the workplace and what exactly is ultimately that future. Is the office going to exist in the future? And if so, how is it going to look like? Second, we're going to talk about the workforce and this tug of war that seems to be constantly taking place between the worker and the employee that we constantly are seeing in the news. At the same time, what's really going in hybrid? Those companies who've dived into hybrid, are they happy with that journey? And ultimately, what are the key factors to be successful? And then ultimately, you're watching this today because you're a leader. You're a person that wants to be able to make the right decisions. We're going to have a chance to talk in more detail about what it really means to be a leader in this new future of work. So sit back, enjoy this journey with us into the future of work. So maybe it's not so scary, but actually a lot more exciting. Hello, my name is John Guziak, and I'm the head of human capital for Deloitte for Central Europe, with a passion for people, development, and the future, and I'm looking forward to being with you on this journey. It's a pleasure for me today to have with us some expert panelists from all over the world. Today we have Philippe Burger, who is the human capital leader for France, as well as the global workforce transformation leader. Philippe is actually based in Paris and is passionate about learning. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to being here.
Maren Hauptmann is a human capital leader for Germany. She is also a member of the Global Human Capital Executive Organization with more than 20 years of experience. She's passionate about organizational design and, thanks to the future of work redesign. Welcome, Maren.
Welcome.
And all the way from Asia, we have Nicole Scoble-Williams, who is the Global Future of Work leader for Deloitte itself, coming from Tokyo, that is. And her passion is to make work better for humans and humans better at work. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Wonderful to be here.
The future of work, it's about the office, or is it not about the office? The reality today, as we can see in the media over and over again, that employers, or the biggest employers, are now beginning to ask their people to come back to the office, maybe even to demand it. The question is what exactly is this workplace that we actually call the office? And is it the same as it was before the pandemic, or is it different than after? Question ultimately is what is the data telling us from both the hearts and the minds of employees, but also what's really taking place from the employers? So I'm curious, Nick, from your perspective, what's the data helping us to see about this workplace?
The data is helping us to see that the trends are playing out very differently across different geographies, industries, sectors, demographics, even different types of workforce segments, knowledge workers, frontline workers. But what is really interesting is if we just look at the forecast for the percentage of knowledge workers expected to be in a hybrid remote model by the end of this year, globally, 39% of knowledge workers expected to be in a hybrid remote model.
It's a significant group of people.
It is. Here in Germany, though, 49%.
Even higher.
UK, 67%.
Wow.
Now let's go to the US, 71%.
71% of Americans.
Now let's come back to where I live, Japan, 29%.
So complete differences.
It is so different. And so we do need to understand these nuances and dynamics. But what is really clear is that regardless of whether we are seeing on-site, hybrid, remote, we are seeing flexibility on the center of the stage. And flexibility is sticking. So, for example, even in a country like Japan, where we really haven't been able to shift to remote working models in many cases because we often lack the level of digitisation needed to perform certain work remotely. We still are seeing that elevated acceptance of, okay, maybe I'll come to the on-site environment at 10 a.m. today after I've dropped the children at school. Or maybe I'll leave at 3 p.m. this afternoon because I have a medical appointment. And so flexibility is absolutely sticking, regardless of whether it's an on-site first, virtual, or hybrid. And I think that's what we really need to be focusing on.
What's interesting from a country perspective, you're responsible in supporting basically Germany. What do you see the German organizations are now doing when it comes to this workplace?
Yeah, so in Germany, hybrid work models are actually a customary practice. And surprisingly or not, they also were already formal Works Council agreements way before the pandemic, in many cases, in particular in the very large organizations, but it was more like granting a bit of flexibility now and then, but it was formalized. Now, of course, with the pandemic, with everybody moving from the knowledge workers at least into remote work, now this development in direction going back to the office is definitely something that we also see in Germany, in particular in the very large organizations like Volkswagen, SAP, Allianz. So they're also in the media with their back to office requests and pledges almost. However, there is a tension that I see in my clients' organizations and in the market itself in Germany. It's threefold, actually. So the first one is that, in particular for the very large ones that are headquartered here, and they have local organizations, subsidiaries all across the world, the pandemic played out in a very different way, time-wise. So some countries would already go back to office very early, while in Germany, everybody would still be working remotely. So there's a lot of different frameworks and guidelines and rules now in place, and headquarters is asking, am I supposed to imply a global rule there? And then, of course, the local organizations say, no, we're pretty happy with what we have. Please don't, obstruct a general rule on this one. So that's one of the tensions. The second tension is that while leaders and individuals think about, do I go back to the office, yes or no? How do I react? Facility management and the CFO already have made their calculations of how much office space they could actually save and cost savings and, terminating leases, etc. So they're, in a way, not so much a fan of more people coming back. And then there's the third tension that what do workers and leaders actually expect from the workspace when they go back? And in our big quit study here in Europe, we found that 35% actually ask for more individual workplaces to do quiet Teams meetings, video conferencing, teleconferencing, etc., while 26%, that was the second largest group of respondents, said, no, we actually need more open space because when we go back, if we go back, I expect to collaborate. I want to meet with my people, I want to meet the team, and we need to do things together. So already there is a third tension, and I think it's a starting point depending on where you start as an organization. But these three tensions need to be overcome.
So there's really no simple answer to this because,
Absolutely not.
and as you said, we have different groups of people who have different needs and even a different definition of why they want to come to the office. It's not just a one campaign type of environment. I'm curious, what's going on in France?
Well, France actually would be sitting somewhere between Japan and Germany in terms of hybrid working and the culture about remote working. But it's a major shift as compared to what we have seen before the COVID crisis, whereby most organizations didn't like too much having remote working. So we were very much behind many of those countries when it comes in terms of statistics. Less than 5%, 10% of the workforce, even the knowledge workforce, working remotely. So that has shifted completely with more than 40% doing that. But I think to Maren's point earlier on, I think the question one should ask is, why are we coming back to the office? What's the purpose? Why not working remotely? Because to your point, I mean, you can save money on the building, the premises by not having offices. And as Maren raised, if you put people together just to have boxes where they can have teams, a lot of workers would actually tell you, well, I'm better off being at home doing that instead of being at the office, going there and being stuck into my bubble for the full day. So I think we have to think about what we expect from workers, what is different between the remote work and the work in the workplace.
Well, I think the mindset has really, really changed. I remember recently working with a group of executives, and I literally just asked each of the executives in a room, one by one, what's the reason why you're coming to the office? And what was amazing to me is in talking with more than 25 executives, I heard the word relationship, I heard the word connection, I heard the word, interdependence, but what I didn't hear was the word work itself. So the question really comes back down to is why in the world do we actually need a workplace itself? So what do you see are the benefits, and what do we see in the research which is helping people to see that actually work in the workplace makes sense? Nick?
Yeah, I think that we often talk about how do we get more intentional about the tasks that need to be done, the work that needs to be done, the customer needs, the business needs. And we often don't talk a lot about the role of the workplace in our life more broadly, the role that it plays. So, for example, in Asia Pacific, our homes are often not built in a way or structured in a way for work to be performed at home. And so the on-site environment plays a really important role in providing that physical environment to enable me to do my work. It might also be internet access or internet stability, the speed of the internet. It may be heating and cooling. I've been so fascinated with many of my colleagues and friends in India over the last 3 years that talk to me about the role of the building that they work in terms of the infrastructure it provides for their life. There's a supermarket, there's a dry cleaner, there's a doctor's surgery. And so I think as well as thinking about the workplace in terms of just getting the work done, we also need to be mindful that for many of our workers around the globe, the workplace has an even bigger meaning and an even bigger purpose than just helping us to get work done. It's an important part of how we live our life and access some of those facilities.
Mm-hmm. And yes, Philippe?
Yeah, I think one should not underestimate what I would call the chance encounter factor, which is when you work remotely, chance encounter never happens because you're starting your meeting, you're doing it for 45, 50 minutes, for 1 hour, and then you're switching to another. When you go to the workplace, you would actually bump into Maren, and Maren would tell us, well, gee, I met this client last week. I heard about this and this. What do you think? And that would create some opportunities for collaboration, for innovation, maybe for connecting further. I would tell Maren, well, you should speak to Nick about that because that's interesting. So that's also what we need beyond the pure connection, how that chance encounter can create innovation.
So from a structural perspective, people need the office from that need for connection, not necessarily always that intentional connection. That's also really, really, really important. Yeah. And, and it's what's interesting also that I see very clearly is having a conversation recently with an owner of a company that actually owns buildings where offices are located. I asked him, which are the companies that are actually getting more and more people to the office? And what was fascinating for me was he said is those that are offering breakfast. The connection at breakfast, not lunch, not dinner, which we used to have, pre-COVID, but basically sitting down and having breakfast together was building that sense of community, maybe, and ultimately bringing people back together. So workplace, I think, is a very important element for us as leaders to think about in regards to, what is the purpose of the workplace, and for us to seriously sit down and think about looking at that data. We have a significant part of the organization that is going to be in that hybrid environment. We need to recognize and be very clear about when we want people in the office and why we want them there. Because the worst thing that could happen is you come to the office and you have no reason for being there, and you walk out of the office and you feel, in essence, less than you did before. So ultimately, I think this is where we need to come from there. But then that comes back to the point of that workforce versus employer-employee tightrope, which I think we need to now talk about. Recently, my wife actually asked me and invited me to the dinner table, but not for dinner. She actually asked me to sit next to her and her computer because she was actually looking for a job, and LinkedIn was asking her very clearly, do you want an office job, a hybrid job, or a remote job? Reality was that was a key question that actually she had to think about. But actually, that's a question that maybe almost all of us are now asking ourselves. I'm curious, if we think about that, what really is the mentality of our workforce today, from the Generation Z and the millennials all the way up to our own age? So I'm curious, Philippe, as the head of global workforce transformation, what do you actually see is taking place in the hearts and the minds of this new workforce that we have today,
I think
post-COVID?
Well, I think before being a worker, everyone is a consumer, and before being a consumer, everyone is a citizen. If you think about it in your day-to-day life, your personal life, your life as a citizen, everything is much more tailored to your needs. If you want to go to the bank, you don't need to have the banking hours. You can do that whenever you want. If you want to do shopping, you can do shopping online. If you want to express yourself, you can express yourself on the social network and everything as a citizen. So somehow technology has enabled you to feel much more of your needs, or to be much more adaptive to your needs. While when you step into your work on day-to-day as a worker, you expect the same from your organization. You expect your organization to adapt to your needs. And those needs might be changing, by the way, because you're not the same when you are 20, when you are 30, with children, with a partner, at a different stage of your working life. So all of this is to say that we expect the work to be much more adapted to our needs when it comes to compensation, when it comes to where we work, when it comes to what is impacted by my work and everything. So every worker is much more looking into being able to adapt. And to your earlier question to your wife, I guess it's not or, but probably rather and, sometimes not. And I think the work environment needs to adapt that. Maren mentioned earlier on about the idea of how you manage the white collar working in headquarters and the blue collar working in factories or in retail shop. What we've experienced is that some organizations, for example, created some flexibility in the shop workers by offering them, for example, to exchange their shift. So you allocate the shift, but somehow you create the possibility for people to say, well, I'm more interested in working a double shift or working on Saturday and Sunday because it's better paid. I'm less interested because I've got children, whatever. So people can actually adapt that. So you can see that there is a lot of flexibility that is being offered. Maybe your reward packages needs to be adapted. You don't have the same needs as well. So you can do all this. So that's what workers are more and more expecting. So how can the work and the working condition can be adapted to my needs?
So if I can buy Nike shoes online, why can't I actually deliver my work online, right? And why does my boss expect me actually physically to be in the office when in essence he sees me on camera?
Precisely.
Absolutely. Well, I'm curious, from that perspective, though, that must mean that employees believe that they're more productive than at home, right? So I think we all wake up in the morning to want to do a good job. Yeah.
Yes.
So therefore, this idea of productivity, does the work generation today, the workforce, see that they're more productive wherever they are working?
Yeah, I think the notion itself of productivity has to be rethink.
Okay.
So we need to consider what is the outcome of your work instead of just productivity figures based on ROI or whatever Euro figures. It's wider than that. To your point, I think when you are remote working and you actually are trying to think about one topic, focusing, maybe doing a series of meetings, being remote working might be more efficient. But then if you need to be more creative, if you need to have a development discussion with the people of your team, being at the office might be much more productive. If you want to create trust as well, you need to see one another in the eyes, look at the body language and capturing the difficulties that some of your workers are experiencing. And that's, again, a different measure of productivity. So
the mindset toward why I do what I do and how well I do it is really actually basically is changing dramatically. Yeah? And what is the data telling us, Nick, from your perspective? You're so passionate about that data.
Oh, the data tells us that we are in a moment of reevaluation universally. Our Gen Zs and millennials are telling us in our Deloitte Gen Z and millennial studies, around 80% say if I had to go and be in the office on site full time, I would be looking to leave my job.
Wow.
Now, it doesn't matter what research we look at, around 75% of the global workforce says I'm more likely to stay in my current role with my current employer if I will be provided flexible working options moving forward. However, the research is also showing around 70% of employers are now starting to say, I think it's time for our people to come back and spend more time in the on-site environment. So we are seeing this tension between what workers and employers need, want, and expect from each other. We also see it in the LinkedIn data, going back to your conversation with your wife. Less than 15% of jobs advertised are for remote jobs, but they are attracting more than 55% of all job applications. So it is clear that there is this significant moment of reevaluation, and there's a real call to action for workers and employers to realign on what they need, want, and expect from each other to unleash that motivation, that energy, that productivity and performance that we've been talking about.
Well, it really sounds like there's this we're starting to see almost a tug of war, yeah? So before it was like, you would see that people would be, in the office, at least the original kind of hybrid principles would be like, 2 days in the office, 3 days at home. Now we're starting to see this shift to 3 days rather than 2 days. So this tug of war between the employer and the employee, the employees seeing flexibility, they can do anything online, so why can't I work from online? The employer saying is, look, I really want you back. And I'm curious from your perspective, Maren, this tug of war between the employer and employee, what do you think is going to be the final result of that?
Well, I don't know what the final result will be, but I feel that it's really, to your point, Nick, a very fascinating point in time, because Philippe talked about the individualization is going on. Everything is tailored to, I want to do as a citizen, I want to do this and that. Now I can do it online. I'm fully flexible. I can decide. But that's very difficult in a team when all of a sudden everybody wants to decide for him or herself on when actually to work, where to work, and how to work and how fast, etc. So a lot of tension is building up, and I believe that employers also need to take some deliberate action in how to build guidance and how to give teams and departments something at hand to find their way on how to align all the individual needs, requirements, expectations also around that. Not to talk about HR, that they will struggle massively in having to orchestrate and administer all those individualized plans on, I want to have this pay plan, I want to have this work plan, I want to have... And we see that also increasingly people are actually, so the workforce itself is overwhelmed by the amount of choices that we have. So I had a client, and they decided to also grant more flexibility for teams on the shop floor also. So at least teams that would have to work out some sort of shift plans. So they gave more flexibility. And in the beginning, everybody was super enthusiastic about it, motivated. Yeah, I can do this and that. It took only a few weeks when everybody said, can we go back to some more rigid plans, please? Because they're also more reliable for me going forward. So I know what in 8, 9, 10 weeks' time my work schedule will look like. I might not love it 100%, but I can at least plan around it. So I think there is some tension that we have to actually dissolve by giving more guidance and enabling the entire workforce more. Because I know that Gen Z millennials, they have certain preferences, but I would not overlook also the need and strive for flexibility also in older generations, because we have all accustomed to more flexibility over the past 2.5 years. And those habits build quickly, and it's very hard to overcome them.
It's really interesting because I think the word independence needs to be more replaced by what I would call interdependence, because as you said, the fact that this chaos that occurred because everybody wants to do their own thing, I almost see it like kids are on a playground and there's no rules to play soccer. For those in Europe, football. And the point, as you're saying, is the fact is that people have to come to this recognition that actually to be effective and to enjoy my job, I actually really need that interdependence. Do you agree with that? Or
I would, yeah. Definitely. It's a system. So you have to take a systemic view also on any organization. You're not completely alone in that organization. You depend and interdepend with your co-workers, your boss, etc.
So it sounds like, though, we have this tug of war. I think what we need to kind of recognize is that actually, if the employer is looking constantly as the employee as the other side, that tug of war is really going to continue. But I think what we need to see, and what I'm hearing from the data, is this recognition that actually we need to recognize both the worker and the employer are on the same side. Both are learning new things, and at the same time, we need to move into this new future of work with more adaptability. How does that sound?
And John, I would say the stakes are high.
They are very high.
We're in an environment right now where we have talent and skill shortages. And so in this type of environment, the ability for organizations to access, engage and develop the talent that they need, the choices that Maren's talking about and the tailorization, the stakes are really high. And so we do need to ensure that these decisions are being very considered, because it really is becoming a differentiator for organizations today in their ability to access, engage and develop that talent that they so desperately need right now.
So the question for companies today really is how do we make this work rather than should this work or not?
Yeah. And the answer is probably to be adapted per company. I mean, we've seen organizations starting with the flexibility in the 4.5, 5 day week.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point about productivity, we are focusing about the work outcome. And you're responsible to saying, I want to do that in 5 days because I'm a working from the office person or remote working person. Others would say, no, I can do that in 4 days or 4.5 because I want half a day for personal time.
Well, it's interesting going back to the story with my wife. She did click on the LinkedIn hybrid because she said that's the experience that I've enjoyed the most, and that will help our family to be much more productive and enjoy life much more. And ultimately, basically, that's what she really wanted. So interesting that we're moving into this new world of new ways of working with the workforce itself. Well, we've now talked about the workplace and we've now talked about flexibility. But now let's talk about hybrid. And I think the best way to think about that analogy, just like with my wife, is the fact is my daughter recently wanted to actually play American football. Well, as a proud American, I added the opportunity to be able to help her to understand the rules, the language, touchdown, first down, and all those other types of languages and principles that are important. Even though it looks like a soccer field, the reality, it's a different sport. However, hybrid is a bit different because the reality was very easy for me to kind of share the language, the framework, everything that's important about making American football work the way it does that could help my daughter to learn it. But hybrid, this is something new to us all. At the end of the day, we really didn't have a language. What is hybrid? We never really used that word before. What about basically the framework? Is it 2 days? Is it 3 days? Do we need MS Teams? Do we need Zoom? All of these different elements to actually make this work and be successful. I think the biggest problem we have today is we keep thinking about it as trying to play the same game when in reality it's a different one. So today we're going to focus a little bit more on that element of effectiveness and productivity. So Nick, from your perspective, hybrid, it's new, it's different, and unfortunately I can't teach it to my daughter. What are you learning and what is the data telling us about that effectiveness?
John, I love the way that you've talked about this new world. And I often refer back to Einstein's famous words, you can't use an old map to explore a new world.
That's so true.
We need to create the new maps and the new mental models to make hybrid work or to make this new world of work. I think the Australia situation is really important in highlighting how perplexed it is right now. In Australia, we have the most productive remote workers in the world. But the research continues to show they're the most burned out.
Wow.
Now, universally, we are seeing the well-being, the mental health emergency. Our Deloitte research is showing that majority of women tell us they're more stressed today than they were a year ago. Gen Zs, millennials telling us they're stressed all or most of the time. And even 75% of C-suite executives are telling us that they are seriously considering leaving their job for one that will better support their well-being. So it's clear that we need these new maps and mental models. In our 2023 Global Human Capital Trends Report, we talk about the fact that we think we need to stop asking the question of whether it should be 1 day, 2 day, 3 days.
It's not Tuesday or Thursday.
Exactly. We suggest that we need to actually reposition the workplace to be an input to the work itself. So get laser focused on the work that needs to be performed, the moments that matter in the work that needs to be performed, and use that to inform the way that we design different types of on-site, virtual, hybrid experiences that enable workers to really perform the work in a way that will elevate the experiences and outcomes for themselves, for their customers, for the business, and society at large. And I think that that's something that we're not seeing a lot of yet. Because, for example, in our human capital trends research, we only had 15% of respondents say that they think the design of the work itself is important in creating the future workplace model.
Wow.
Perhaps that is why only 24% of our respondents said they're feeling very ready to actually create that future workplace model, despite the fact that that's what they've been focusing on for the last 3 years or so. So I do think we're in a moment where it's clear there's a lot more to be done to work out how do we make hybrid work.
And it's interesting because, again, this idea that, 70% of organizations, as we can see from the statistics, believe that they have those principles in place, and yet 24% of those individuals are saying is they don't feel supported. Yeah. And so it's like, in essence, asking my daughter to basically play the sport without actually really giving her the tools to be able to do so. So I'm curious, Philip, from your perspective, working with this global work transformation, what exactly are the key factors of success to make hybrid work? Is it just Tuesday or Thursday, or are there some other critical things that are important? I think my daughter needs to go more than just Tuesday and Thursday if she wants to learn how to play American football.
Yeah, probably. And I think if it's only Tuesday and Wednesday or Tuesday and Thursday, what would happen with the Monday and the Fridays and the Wednesday? Probably your CFO would raise to you that maybe we are not making most of our workplace, so we need to reconsider that. I think Maren raised that earlier on. People are looking for some kind of guidance and rules as to what's going to be working. 73% of the people are actually asking for more guidance, more rules.
Well, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's the vast majority of people. They want flexibility, but to your earlier point, they want that flexibility with rules, with regulation. To your earlier comment is, how do you play together? I think in the way we are considering that is, again, what we want to achieve when we are at work, what we want to do and how. And maybe what we want to do is ensuring that, yes, being at work 1 or 2 days at a minimum, or 3 days at a minimum for everyone, but maybe it's more flexibility with that work, but ensuring that people can join hybrid session, and that we are really full remote or full diverse approach or full on-site approach, getting those rules. One consideration, and I'll come back to what Nick raised, is that we've seen a lot of the workforce, the white collar, the knowledge worker, being more and more stressed up by work, as you raised. We've seen sickness coming to a high because people are overwhelmed with solicitation. So we need to ensure also that we put those rules as to when we contact, when we don't contact. If I'm putting an 8 o'clock meeting on site, it's not the same thing as putting an 8 o'clock call or Teams or Zoom conference. And we need to be able to have people adapting to that. We have seen that almost 40% of the workforce is considering that people are not taking care enough of their house or personal situation. It's a massive figure. It's also related to the fact that by being remote working, we lose those chance encounters that I was mentioning, which are basically, well, how do you truly feel? It's not like just in the meeting that starts remotely, how are you? And everybody say, yeah, everything is fine. You need to have that time to have people really expressing themselves on that. And that's a crucial question for us, that we make sure people take care of the house, of their work.
Wow. And Maren, from your perspective, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, you already talked about mental health and well-being being on the rise as paramount topics. You talked about flexibility there. And I think what we really have to keep in mind is that workplace models, and we're talking about how to make hybrid work.
Sure.
That workplace models are inextricably tied to the engagement levels of individuals and of teams. That's one thing that we have to keep in mind when making choices and when giving guidance. And the second piece is that mental health and well-being have become such paramount pictures that they span across the entire workforce, no matter what generation, no matter what type of work, no matter where or in which situations they are at the moment. So, and a few data points on that one. So it comes from a productivity paranoia study, is it called, by Microsoft. And it's from last year, but however, there's some interesting data because they can gather all those productivity signals from Teams when you work with this collaboration tool. And already last year, the number of meetings, chats, etc., was up 153%. And they already said last year that this is going to stay. And we all know that these work days have become extremely compressed, extremely dense. So it's very normal that now work hours stretch into the morning, they stretch into the evening. It's very normal that then somebody asked to go back to the office is a bit overwhelmed and says, sorry, and then I have to commute back and forth. That is just not doable. But organizations have to keep in mind that they really need to enable their people to take their agency and use their agency to decide what is best for them. And if that means saying no to an 8 o'clock meeting because they commute to the office because we asked them to go back to the office, then we need to accept this. We also have to keep in mind that there are different phases of teams. So when you have a high-performing team that has stayed along together for quite some time, they can work remotely. That's no problem. But when you have a freshly formed team, they might need the flexibility to work collaboratively in the office or any other on-site location to just get to know each other so that then they can go remote. So there's a lot that is actually happening that we have to keep in mind to enable our workers for themselves, for their well-being, to stay engaged, to stay with the company. But we also definitely have to enable leaders because they are ultimately, so the team leads, the first people workers turn to and say, how are we supposed to do this? What are the rules that that shall apply? And my advice would always be that we all need to become much more explicit on how we align on the requirements that an organization might have or a specific task might have, but also the needs of the individuals in those teams. And this explicitness is something that we actually have to educate our leaders on.
And to be able to understand that.
Yes.
And I'm curious, when it comes, because you now use the word teams.
Yes.
And when we think about hybrid principles, we're always thinking about the organization. Yeah. And what we see loud and clear is that hybrid really is very much about teams and the teamwork itself. I'm curious from your own, maybe on your own personal examples, is what do we need to do as organizations to be able to build those teams, but to keep the same culture, to keep the same unique DNA? Let's be honest with you. We're at Deloitte ourselves, and we have, in essence, hybrid environments for our people. What exactly is the organization responsible for to support those teams, as well as the mental health of those individuals?
I think because of the remote working, again, we don't meet as often as we used to. The organization's responsibility is creating the connection moment. So I do believe that you need to invest more into team informal drinks, dinner events, get together on the same place. Probably opening up the agendas when you have that. So instead of having one seminar for your 100, 200, 500 people coming together with a very packed agenda, you actually loosening up a little bit so that people can have time to connecting, to exchanging, to discussing. That's what we are looking for when we get it together. So I think that's a responsibility of the organization of organizing this much more than they use in the past, and probably having more flexibility for the manager to organize this as
and
well.
Even budget.
And budget, yes. And maybe some of the savings that you achieve in your workplace, you can actually invest that into this.
We can go out more often to having a beer. Nick, from your perspective.
I think there's a lot that an organization can do without having to think about any sophisticated strategies and programs, to really design into the way that we enable teams simple things like team charters or team agreements. How do we actually embed into the way that a team works together, collaborates together, performs together, so that there's that moment? I mean, Maren talked about that moment of forming. How do we make sure that in that moment when we form or when somebody new joins, we have a shared understanding of what we need, want, and expect from each other? We talk about those moments that matter. Where are the moments where we need to all be together in person? Where are the moments where there may be personal reasons why we're going to need to be elsewhere? Or it may be because of the nature of the work. We're going to want to be elsewhere to be more productive. And I think that we often try to over-design some of these things. But these are the types of challenges that I would suggest, yes, COVID has exacerbated them, but these are things we've always wanted and needed. How do we work as a team, respectfully, supporting each other as one? And yeah, something as simple as those team agreements, team charters can be so very powerful.
So it really sounds, Maren?
Yeah, and Nick, just, you reminded me of something that we very often forget to mention. I mean, teams used to be, most of them used to be co-located, the majority of them. You might,
true.
Have some teams across borders, collaboration, etc. But in essence, they were co-located, which meant you come in, even if you're a new joiner and new to the workplace altogether, but you can observe. You can just observe how things are being done.
Shadowing.
And now we have to be more explicit to this point. We have to make it so tacit knowledge on what is right, what is wrong, how do we do these things, how do we handle clients, how do we collaborate, how do we communicate. You need to make it explicit, and that is, of course, an extra workload, again, for the leaders, but they need to accept that this is now a task for them as well. And those are means that you can use, but it's really important. Otherwise, the productivity of your team will just be low.
And I think this is a major challenge that we face, because if we look at the 2019 global human resources trends, what blew me away was the largest percentage, 93% of organizations were saying that belonging was something that was becoming very, very important and very, very difficult to do. And the irony is that study was done a year before COVID. So I think we have a major challenge here, which is to recognize is that, hybrid is here to stay. It's a new game. But at the same time, we do have things that we have tools now. We have the ability, we've got data, we've got research to be able to say that it can work, but we need to do it differently. Then, playing rugby is very different, as you would say, than playing football is very different than playing football, right, from a soccer perspective. But I think back to that point of teams is, with a team, you've got a team leader. So I'm very interested to find out in more detail about what exactly we need to do with our leaders. What was clear from our discussion is that actually the organizations have a lot of responsibility and a lot of capability to help us to be able to be more successful. But at the end of the day, is it just about organizations, or is it also about the leaders? Now, Maren, you mentioned actually already about this leadership productivity paranoia. Maybe that's not something familiar to a lot of people. Can you explain a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, let's state that practically all leaders are overwhelmed by this boundaryless work. So just as much as the workforce is looking for guidance, for direction, etc., also leaders are, because it's very hard if there's no reference point. And the leadership paranoia that I mentioned from this Microsoft study, like hybrid work is just work, from 2022, they state this leadership or the productivity paranoia, to be clear. And the paranoia insists on the point that only 12% of the leaders feel that their teams are actually productive and actually performing. Only 12%, actually doing what they're supposed to do. Whereas the employees, the team members, feel at 87% that they're being very productive because they have a lot of meetings, they have a lot to do, and they work long hours.
I see a major contrast here.
That's the paranoia. But then there's a second study from this year, very interesting, from Slack, and they have this point on the productivity paradox. Because what leaders actually do to say, my team is productive, yes or no, they rely on visible activities. This is why they also love them to be in the office, because they can walk the halls, they can see if people are busy, no? Not productive, busy. However, the paradox is that the workers themselves, they would love to be assessed and judged on the outcomes of their work. So it's this very old connotation of input versus output versus outcome. And we all know that it's much better to actually assess productivity when looking at the outcomes.
So it looks like there's a completely new mindset that's required for leaders to understand what it really means to be productive. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's not only the mindset, it's actual behavior of the leaders themselves, and they need to be reskilled. And the interesting point is they all need to be reskilled really independently of the work model that they choose, the type of hybrid work model they choose. And even more interesting, also the leaders that everybody felt they are role models, they are the best leaders that we have pre-pandemic. Also, they need to at least upskill, not necessarily reskill, but upskill. So it really touches upon the entire community or the entire workforce segment of leaders also, that they need to be enabled. And I mean, leadership is in essence a transponder of company culture. So leadership culture is very, very important because it's completely independent of the workplace and it can bind the people together into the organization. So we have to look into this.
So both leadership and culture are going to be pretty important.
Yes.
Now, how well, I'm curious from a data point, how well do organizations actually feel that they have prepared leaders?
So our 2023 Human Capital Trends research really highlighted the leadership imperative here that Maren's been touching on. We weren't necessarily surprised that 23% of respondents said, we don't think our organisation has leaders with the capabilities to lead in this new boundaryless world that Maren touched on. We weren't necessarily surprised with that. We've always seen leadership as being a really important challenge that needs to keep evolving. But there were 3 data points that did surprise and in fact alarm us. Perhaps the most important one was only 15% of respondents said, we believe our organisation has leaders with the capabilities to lead inclusively in this new world of work. Now, if we reflect on all of the discussions that we've had here today, we're talking about well-being, mental health, we're talking about connectivity, collaboration, we're talking about how do we make sure we're supporting our workers, but also meeting the business needs, the customer needs, and those things. So that was really alarming. Inclusive leadership being table stakes to be able to enable our approach to new ways of working. The second data point was only 16% said that they believe they've got leaders with the ability to use technology to improve work outcomes and team performance. Now, I think we all know that the technology memo arrived a long time ago. So again, our leaders are needing this enablement. And then the third data point, which relevant to some of what we've touched on already, only 18% of respondents said they believe that their organisation has leaders ready to design the future workplace model. So our takeaway from that was Leadership 101 has changed. That in this new boundaryless world, we have these new capabilities, these new behaviours that we need to enable and elevate those outcomes and team performance in new and different ways that previously were not necessarily needing to be relevant in the flow of work before the pandemic.
You know, it's interesting because one of the CEOs that I talked to, recently basically said is, John, I used to believe that I was kind of at a university level when it comes to leadership. And then thanks to COVID and thanks now to hybrid, I recognize I'm back in elementary school. Yeah, it's that recognition of, my goodness gracious, it's time to learn again. At the same time, we have executive search firms that are now looking for people who, in essence, are effective leaders for today and the future. And I'm curious, if you were one of those executive headhunters, what would be the behaviors that you would be looking for, actually, Philippe, when it comes to an effective hybrid leader?
Yeah, I think the framework has changed as Maren raised. The competencies are there, but maybe we need to develop them differently. And to your earlier point, Nick, we need to analyze the situation with a different map. We cannot use the same old map. So to your point, I think we are looking at leaders that are much more inclusive, able also to assess better the status, the situation of the individual. We want leaders that are able to manage much more into an ambiguous situation. To your other point, Maren, they need to provide or to offer more trust to their workforce, to be much more adaptive, because it's, to a degree, it's easy to be a leader in a very downward structured organization where you say something, everybody will follow. It's easy. I mean, you just give instruction and you ensure that people execute. What is more complex when you are into an environment that is more adaptive, that is more complex to and that is changing. You need behave that inspire leaders that would inspire their workforce so that they can adapt to those changing situations. We've seen that in large organizations such as the Army, for example, whereby they are organizing things so that teams can actually adapt more to the situation on the ground. So they give good direction, but actually they leave their teams adapting to what is changing on the ground. So that's the type of changes that we expect in the leadership model. We've seen a lot of organizations doing that. A good example is probably Michelin with their new eye care leadership model, for example. They have shifted the way they assess, develop their leaders.
Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to lead individuals who, in essence, are working for you full time. But we're also dealing with a completely new shift in the world of work, which as leaders, we're expected to lead not only full-time employees, but those that are gig workers, those are living in countries completely different than ourselves. And I'm curious from your perspectives, what exactly are those challenges and how can we help our leaders to adapt to contract workers or those that are ultimately basically they never even physically see? Who wants to go with that one?
Well, I think you have, well, first of all, there are a lot of risks associated with that extended workforce that are not assessed. So how you manage things like behavior, because somehow they represent your organization. How do you manage knowledge? Because somehow you need to make sure that those workers won't leave with their knowledge. So you want to ensure that will work. So in terms of how you deal with this from a leadership standpoint, it means that you need to assess a very different framework around risk. Also, to your point, I think when you engage a workforce, you don't engage your workers and your workforce the same way when they are full-time workers and when they are gig workers and when they are contingent workers. A very interesting situation we've seen with one of our clients a few years ago. They were actually measuring engagement, and the engagement levels were really high. And yet, the productivity level, the financial results, everything was going down. And they couldn't understand why. And we did a lot of research on that, understanding what was happening. Actually, we did realize that the contingent workforce was actually growing over time, and they were never measured the engagement level of that contingent workforce. And what happened when they measured it, they realized it was very low. They had very large issues in terms of how they were treated, how they were projected in the long term, integrated in the teams and everything. So we worked on that so that the workforce as a whole would be considered as just one team and improving all the impact of that workforce. So very interestingly is how you consider that workforce on a wider standpoint.
And that goes back down to both the organizational's responsibilities, but also the leader's role in making that actually happen.
Yeah, I think you've got right now, in the past, organization used to be, well, one place, fixed hours. You had basically one physical space where things would happen, close to your customer, etc. All of this has changed. Everything that was happening within the organization would stay within the organization. If we had an argument, the two of us, this would stay between us. Now, all of those examples that I've given are just basically no longer applicable. So as a leader, I need to be very much consistent in the way I'm behaving compared to the way I'm the speeches that I'm using, the direction that I'm offering to my people. So that consistency also is key about what kind of speeches I bring on the table and how I behave.
Yeah, and that reminds me of one thing. So we very often think about how to engage contingent and gig workers, etc. So more on the soft end, potentially, of leadership behavior. But what we see in one of our highly confidential projects at the moment is that there is a lot of managerial skills and challenges also in just accessing and knowing about the sheer data on your gig workers and contingent workers, because you need to also be audit-proof in that sense. So before you start thinking about what speech to deliver and how to interact with those parts of your workforce outside of your P&L, you have to know who that actually is, how many and when and where. And there we have this strange split in the responsibilities between the CHRO, who is responsible for the on-balance sheet employees and workers, and then the potentially chief procurement officer, who knows everything about the contractual workers. So, and in our engagement, we're trying to collect all the data and bring that together, because this is actually the starting point, and it's something new, something that leaders didn't have to do necessarily, but it grows and it's a challenge, and they need to be skilled also in that aspect.
So it really sounds like we really need to be able to, on one hand, we really need to reskill, in essence, leadership in our organizations today. Because if on one hand we're talking about a different workplace, where exactly our employees are, we're talking ultimately about the fact is that hybrid is here to stay. And the fact is that who we're actually leading are going to be very, very different. I don't think we have the skill sets today that we actually need.
And John, building on Maren's point, this is an absolutely new agenda. You know, what we're hearing about here is workforce risk. This is a board level agenda. So the skills and capabilities, not just for leadership, not just for the C-suite team. I've been engaged in a lot of conversations recently with boards who are reassessing their skills matrix and their capabilities for what they need in the boardroom.
At all levels of the organization.
Exactly.
So it's not about just the people down below that need help, but we, even at the C-suite, actually need that help. Yeah, Philippe?
Yeah, and I think what is probably the challenge is that what made the success of the leaders in the last few years is not what is going to make the success of the future leaders. So the leadership framework is different, and it's difficult to accept that somehow maybe tomorrow's leaders would be different from what made me a leader today. So that's a challenge.
And a big one, I think. And it's a great, but on the other hand, you know, as Mr. Positive, the reality is it's also a fantastic opportunity. If, like that CEO that I talked to, we recognize that it's okay to still, you know, be back down in elementary school in this new world of work that we're in. Yeah. One last question I want to raise, which is leadership and culture. Yeah. So we talked about leadership and we talked about the skills. We've talked about basically the challenge of who we're actually leading. But we also have another challenge, which is actually the type of leadership based on our nationalities and our culture. Yeah. You know, France is, you know, shifting more to the stronger, you know, the 4-day, productivity can be done in less time. You know, and in Germany, I'm curious, what advice would you give our viewers in regards to how to look at the national element of leadership in this? You know, you mentioned inclusivity. Yeah. So what's your recommendation, Nick?
Deep listening. The most overlooked task, if you like, or tactic that I've observed over the last 3 years is deep listening. You know, really understanding deeply what is it, where are those unknown and unmet needs that we may not have previously thought about that we need to be addressing and tackling, and recognizing that those will be different across different geographies, industries, sectors, demographics. We hear a lot of our clients say, I want best practice. And assuming that just because one particular case study or approach in this country, in this industry, will work for them. And so I think the deep listening is really where some of the magical guidance needs to come from to ensure that we're focusing on what matters most and doing it in a culturally relevant context. Obviously, I live in Japan, and we all know that in Japan, our magical country there, seniority is king. So when we're talking about trying to reduce spans and layers and empowerment, we need to think about that a little bit differently in a country that really is so successful within a seniority type approach compared to one that's really trying to unleash empowerment and, trust. So I think that deep listening is really critical.
And how about in France?
No, I would concur to that about the deep listening, about the trust. I think in France we are a Latin country, so we tend to be adaptive. So that actually what made the success of large multinational companies back in the 90s or beginning of the 2000s, being very adaptive in the country where you operate. Coming back to the statistics we're seeing where people are looking for rules, for guidance on how to do things, I think we need to find the right balance in this. In what kind of guidance can we provide at the group level, making sure that somehow people have got some rules on where to play or how.
Awesome. Excellent. And how about in Germany?
I think we're very adaptive, but we want clarity. So whenever we are able to have a clear new leadership framework and everybody accepts that actually every leader has to unlearn something and learn a few new things, then that will be successful. But we want to have the clarity for sure.
I think that unique DNA is so important for us. And I think that even though we are talking about the new ways of work, the workplace, leadership, it's so important for us to also recognize the things that made us successful. What are those things that we want to take with us as leaders? And so today we've had a chance, if you will, to talk about the workplace, the recognition of where do we want to work, and should I buy that village house or should I keep that apartment? Second of all, we had a chance to talk in more detail about the workforce. And rather than looking at it as a tug of war between the worker and the employer, we need to take a look at it and then working on the same side, working together, pulling together, recognizing this new challenge facing. We also recognize that hybrid is here to stay, but it is about principles. And the fact is that we need to recognize that it's not just about adding new principles, but it's really recognizing we need to play a new game. At the same time, as leaders, we need to recognize that requires new vocabulary. That requires us to have different understanding of how things actually work and can be effective. And that requires us to learn, but also to unlearn. And as Nick has said at one point, at all levels. So today we hope that this data, our conversation with you, has been able to help you, to challenge you, to help you to recognize that the future is bright, but you have to take full advantage of it and you need to learn and unlearn with it. So thank you very much.